USS O'Bannon, a Fletcher-class destroyer, was the second ship of the United States Navy to be named for Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, the Marine Corps's hero of honor. O'Bannon was laid down by Bath Iron Works Corp. in Bath, Maine on 3 March 1941, and launched 19 February 1942, sponsored by Mrs. E. F. Kennedy, descendant of Lieutenant O'Bannon. O'Bannon and her sister ship Nicholas were the first two Fletchers to be launched. O'Bannon was commissioned at Boston on 26 June 1942, Commander Edwin R. Wilkinson in command. O'Bannon was the U.S. Navy's most decorated destroyer during World War II, earning 17 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation. 1942. O'Bannon briefly trained for war in the Caribbean and sailed from Boston on 29 August 1942 for the Southwest Pacific, where the long and arduous Guadalcanal campaign had just begun. For over a year, the Navy stretched thin to cover its worldwide commitments at a period when new ships were just beginning to join the fleet in any number was to fight and fight again in the Solomon Islands in one of the most bitterly contested campaigns of history, wresting air and sea control from the Japanese and providing the Marine Corps and the Army with every possible support as they gained ground inch by inch on the myriad islands. Assigned the destroyer Squadron 21, O'Bannon played a valiant part in these endeavors, winning a Presidential Unit Citation. Based at Noumea, New Caledonia, O'Bannon first escorted Copafi on a run to Guadalcanal, where on 9 October, 20 Marines flew the Grumman F-4F Wildcats off Copafi's decks, desperately needed as reinforcements at beleaguered Henderson Field. Through the remainder of the month, O'Bannon sailed the New Hebrides and Southern Solomons on escort duty. On 7 November at Noumea, she joined Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan's support group, ready to sail with a convoy carrying critical reinforcements, replacements, food, ammunition, and aviation material. On the approach to Guadalcanal, O'Bannon sighted and fired on a surfaced enemy submarine, holding it down while the convoy passed safely. On the afternoon of 12 November, the partially unladen transports were attacked by 16 enemy torpedo bombers. 11 were shot down. O'Bannon fired on 4 of the enemy planes. Now came word that the Japanese were moving south in force. 2 battleships, a light cruiser, and 14 destroyers were bound to destroy Henderson Field by bombardment, to break up the American reinforcement mission, and to cover reinforcement movements of their own. O'Bannon and the other ships of the support force, 2 heavy and 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, confronted the greatly superior enemy early on 13 November in Iron Bottom Sound, surnamed for the number of ships on both sides sunk during the Guadalcanal campaign. O'Bannon boldly attacked the Japanese battleship Hyatt, closing so near. The battleship could not depress her main battery far enough to fire on the destroyer. O'Bannon's gunfire, in combination with the attacks of the rest of the force, damaged Hyatt so badly that she was a sitting duck for the air attack, which forced her scuttling the next day. This first engagement of the naval battle of Guadalcanal was short but furious. 2 American light cruisers, in one of which Rear Admiral Norman Scott lost his life, and 4 destroyers were lost, while 2 Japanese destroyers were sunk, and Hyatt prepared for her doom. Above all, the Japanese were turned back, and Henderson Field was saved from destruction. The importance of this success is illustrated by the fact that the next day, Henderson aviators sank 11 enemy troop transports attempting to reinforce the island. Through October 1942, O'Bannon protected landings, carried out escort duties from Noumea and Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal, and Tulungi, joined in bombardments at Guadalcanal, Munda, and Kolombangara, and shouldered her share of the nightly patrols up the slot, guarding against Japanese reinforcements. 1943. Retiring from such a run early 5 April, O'Bannon sighted the Japanese submarine Row 34 on the surface and made to ram it. At the last moment, the officers decided that the sub may be a mine layer, and the rudder was turned hard to avoid the collision. This action brought the destroyer directly alongside the sub. As the Japanese sailors attempted to man the 3-inch deck gun, the O'Bannon's deckhands, not having sidearms, grabbed potatoes from nearby storage bins and pelted the Japanese with them. Thinking the potatoes were hand grenades, the submarine's sailors were too occupied with throwing them away from the sub to fire. This gave the O'Bannon the opportunity to distance itself to fire its guns at the sub and damage the conning tower. Although the sub still managed to submerge, O'Bannon used depth charges to finally sink it. During this period, the O'Bannon also splashed at least 2 enemy aircraft in various attacks. This duty was tense and demanded the best of men, and the ship's in-port time was minimal, a few hours to fuel and reprovision, and the ships were off again. O'Bannon fought in many surface actions. The Battle of Kula Gulf, in which O'Bannon fought with 3 cruisers and 3 other destroyers against 10 Japanese destroyers, swept the enemy from the area, though an American cruiser was lost. A week later, the Battle of Kolombangara had to be fought in the same waters against a Japanese cruiser, 5 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The same American force sank the Japanese cruiser Jinsu and turned the smaller ships away, losing 1 destroyer themselves and having 3 cruisers damaged. For the next 2 months, O'Bannon spent most of her time in Vela Gulf, guarding landings, intercepting Japanese troop convoys and covering escorts, and fighting off air attacks. With the aid of sister destroyers, she sank a number of barges, 2 submarine chases, an armed boat, and a gunboat on various patrols. The climax of operations in the area was the Battle of Vela Lavida on the 6th of October, brought on by Japanese attempts to evacuate the troops from that island. With Selfridge and Chevalier, O'Bannon made the first attack on the evacuation force, a group of 9 or 10 destroyers and smaller armed craft. The 3 American ships contacted 6 enemy destroyers, shrugged at the odds, and raced at 33 knots to launch torpedoes and open gunfire. Japanese destroyer Yugumu was turned into a blazing hulk, but both Selfridge and Chevalier took torpedo hits. O'Bannon was close on Chevalier's stern when the latter was struck, and the most radical maneuvers could not keep her from swinging into her sister's side. The enemy retired with 3 newly arrived American destroyers in pursuit, while O'Bannon guarded her stricken sisters, rescuing the survivors of Chevalier. 1944. O'Bannon made battle repairs at Tulungi, then sailed to the west coast for overhaul. By the 18th of March 1944, she was back in the Solomons, ready for her part in the series of westward-moving amphibious assaults that won New Guinea. Again, it was escort and bombardment repeatedly until the 18th of October, when O'Bannon cleared Hollandia to escort reinforcements for the invasion of Leyte. The convoy was brought in safely on the 24th of October, the eve of the battle for Leyte Gulf. O'Bannon guarded the northern transport area and patrolled the entrances to Leyte Gulf during the battle, coming under air attack. Thus, she played her part in the definitive destruction of the Japanese Navy. 1945. Through June 1945, O'Bannon operated primarily in the Philippines, serving in the escort or assault force for the long roll call of invasions: Ormoc Bay, Mindoro, Lingayen Gulf, Bataan, Corregidor, Palawan, Zamboanga, Cebu, and Carabo. Air attacks were frequent in the early period, and O'Bannon splashed several raiders. During the Lingayen offensive on 31 January 1945, O'Bannon, with 3 other destroyers, attacked and sank an enemy submarine. Japanese records studied after the war indicate it was most likely Row 115. At the end of April and early in May, O'Bannon interrupted her Philippine operations to give fire support to Tarakan, Borneo, and cover minesweeping operations there. O'Bannon rendezvoused with a group of escort carriers off Okinawa on 17 June and guarded them as they struck against Sakashima Gunter. In July, she protected the large carriers as they flew strikes on northern Honshu and Hokkaido. With the close of the war, O'Bannon patrolled the coast of Honshu until 27 August, when she joined Nicholas and Taylor to escort Missouri into Tokyo Bay by order of Admiral William Halsey. Because of the valorous fight up the long road from the South Pacific to the very end, she patrolled until 1 September. She then sailed to San Francisco and San Diego, where she was decommissioned after overhaul on 21 May 1946. 1949 to 1962. Between 17 January 1949 and 10 February 1950, O'Bannon was converted to an escort destroyer at Long Beach Naval Shipyard. She was redesignated DD-450 on 26 March 1949. O'Bannon was recommissioned on 19 February 1951 to serve out of Pearl Harbor. She sailed for her first tour of duty with the United Nations forces repelling communist aggression in Korea on 19 November and, during the next 7 months, she guarded carriers at sea as their air groups struck targets in Korea, served as flagship for the Wonsan Element, East Coast Blockade and Escort Group, fired on enemy gun emplacements, road and rail supply routes, ammunition depots, and troop concentrations, and protected convoys moving between Korea and Japan. A training period out of Pearl Harbor began upon her return home on 20 June 1952, and she took part in U.S. Atomic Energy Commission operations off Eniwetok. O'Bannon cleared Pearl Harbor late in April 1953 for the Far East, where her primary mission was screening carriers. Thereafter, she served on the Taiwan Patrol and in exercises off Japan and Okinawa. Between the Korean War and the Vietnam War, O'Bannon took her part in the intricately planned schedule that assured the United States that its 7th Fleet is always composed of ships and men, whose readiness for any emergency is at its keenest. For O'Bannon, this meant an alternation of roughly 6-month deployments to the Far East and periods spent in training operations and necessary overhauls at Pearl Harbor. While in the Far East, she visited ports in Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, Australia and New Zealand, with brief, welcome recreation calls at Hong Kong. She was often in either New Zealand or Australia for the annual commemoration of the Battle of the Coral Sea, a time of national rejoicing in those countries at which Americans are particularly welcome. She conducted combined operations training with the SEATO allies as well as exercising with Marines at Okinawa and taking part in exercises, preparing for any conceivable demand that might be made on the 7th Fleet. While at Pearl Harbor, she often aided in training reservists in addition to her own training and, at various times, sailed down-range for space orbits and missile shots. In the summer and fall of 1962, she took part in atomic tests at Johnston Island, 1964 to 1970. In 1964, O'Bannon took part in the 1965 film In Harm's Way. O'Bannon first closed the coast of Vietnam during her 1964-65 deployment, when, on the 26th of December, she left Hong Kong to patrol and conduct hydrographic surveys. Much of her 1966 tour was spent as planner guard for Kitty Hawk, while the carrier's jets struck targets in South and North Vietnam to lessen Communist ability to wage war in the South. For a week each in May and June, O'Bannon fired shore bombardments, destroying Viet Cong base camps, troop concentrations, and small craft. The veteran destroyer returned via Yokosuka to Pearl Harbor on the 30th of July. During operations out of Homeport, she trained for Apollo spacecraft recovery operations in August and was a member of the Contingency Recovery Force for the Gemini 11 space flight. Early in September, she visited Guam in the spring of 1967 and returned home early in July to prepare for another Far Eastern deployment. O'Bannon got underway for Japan on the 28th of September and reached Yokosuka on the 7th of October and Subic Bay on the 15th. She returned to the war zone with Constellation and operated as plane guard on Yankee Station through the 4th of November. After a fortnight's respite at Subic Bay and Hong Kong, O'Bannon sailed to Da Nang for shore bombardment. She visited Taiwan early in December but returned to the fighting on the 15th to provide gunfire support just south of the DMZ. 2 days later, she helped to rescue the crew of an American plane that had been hit over the DMZ and had managed to crash just offshore. An enemy battery shelled the destroyer during the operation but failed to score. As 1967 ended, O'Bannon was still on the gun lines supporting Allied ground forces. On the 30th of January 1970, O'Bannon was decommissioned in a ceremony at Pearl Harbor and stricken from the Navy list. She was sold for scrap on the 6th of June 1970 and broken up 2 years later. O'Bannon received the Presidential Unit Citation and 17 battle stars for World War II service, placing her among the most decorated U.S. ships of World War II. She also received 3 more battle stars for service during the Korean War. Nicknamed the Lucky O, none of her crew was awarded the Purple Heart. Quotes: "The history of the Pacific War can never be written without telling the story of the USS O'Bannon. Time after time the O'Bannon and her gallant little sisters were called upon to turn back the enemy. They never disappointed me." Admiral William F. Halsey.